Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. Our language can reveal a great deal about our beliefs, especially the beliefs we're not aware we hold. Every Christian apologetics ministry speaks of helping believers, especially young believers headed off to college, to hold on to their faith, or to keep their faith, or to remain believers. Now notice what's implied in all of these phrases, that Christianity, or at least belief in God, is something one must cling to, must exert positive effort to maintain, and that if such exertions aren't made, a person's Christianity will soon escape their grasp, and they'll return to a default state of unbelief. They will lose their faith, like a drowning person loses a life preserver. But here's the surprising thing. It wasn't always this way, and unbelief wasn't always felt as a default state against which Christians must arm themselves. Today I welcome someone to the program whom I've had the opportunity to get to know over the years and who's become a friend and a voice for wonder in my life. Dr. Joseph Minich is a teaching fellow with the Davenant Institute and is the founding editor of Ad Fontes Journal. He's written a lot about Christianity and the modern mind, and especially this question of why believing in God feels so much like work. His latest book tackles that in a rigorous academic way that I think the church needs and deserves. It's called Bulwarks of Unbelief, Atheism and Divine Absence in a Secular Age. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Joe Minich, welcome to Upstream, brother.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Here is, I think, the most appropriate opening question for what is an enormous conversation, conceptually and content-wise. I talked about these unconsidered beliefs that we hold, things that kind of just live in the background of our spiritual and mental lives. Sketch the unconsidered mental landscape, if you would, of an American evangelical, someone who just loves Jesus and has every intention of holding on to their faith. But what are the pieces of that believer's kind of mental furniture that need to be made visible for us?
Yeah, that's a great question it's obviously part of the burden of the book to kind of put that forward. And largely what I'm doing in the book that kind of tries to answer that question is to look at what are the ways that modern people, say in America, suburban urbanites, average experience, just move around the world materially. How do we form social relationships? How does the automobile shape the way we form communities? How does technology and the vast proliferation of technologies, lights, streets, how does that shape the way that we interact with the messages, you might say, of nature? The Bible can talk about the world revealing the glory of God and talks about natural revelation. What happens when the natures of things, as it were, are kind of suspended a bit for us? And then you add a layer of what happens when we engage in regular kinds of social activity that kind of bring along something, a little bit of a coded value that's subterranean. We walk around as though X or Y is a normal thing to do with each other, that kind of thing. How does that shape us to imagine the social universe? And how does all of that, and this is really the question I think the book gets at, and I think really gets to the deepest part of that question is, how does all of that together shape the way that then we look at things in general? Another way you might put that is, how do all those experiences we have that are just natural to us, we don't even really think about them, just the ways we move around in the world, what does the reality in general, you might say, seem like in the mirror of that set of experiences? That's in a sense what I'm trying to do. And most of us in evangelical circles, we can talk about some of the intellectual streams we're walking around in, or wokeism, or this sort of thing. We're kind of aware of those forces. My book is trying to not say that's not important. It is important, but is to kind of add the material culture angle of it. What is just kind of the apparatuses? I guess I hope that's the plural. One of y'all can correct me that we're walking around in that shape our imagination.
Well, growing up as a Christian, there's this, I guess, dissonance that you experience when you read the scriptures and the way it talks about belief in God versus unbelief. And so there's that famous proverb that says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. We get these great passages in the Psalms about general revelation, about the heavens proclaiming the wonders and works of God, and his handiwork is manifest, right? Romans 1 talks about his nature and his supremacy being so obvious that people don't even have an excuse for being atheist or denying his existence or ignoring him, right? Right now, as we're recording this, you're on this back porch of this beautiful location in South Carolina. And you've got the trees behind you, the rich forest. I've been there. It's a wonderful spot. You hear the cicadas going. And this whole experience of the world, right, in the Bible's worldview, seems like it is so overwhelmingly obvious as the work of God. Like, this is God's work. He did this. He obviously exists. And there's only an idiot could doubt this. How did that become the environment that we're in today? Because I think a lot of people read those passages today and go, when I look at the stars or leaves, I don't think, well, obviously God. What happened there?
Yeah. There's, I think, a lot of things that happen there. And I think maybe the most kind of summary way to put it is to go back to that metaphor of mirrors. The way that we move around in the world just shapes the way we imagine kind of the whole. You could put it that way. Paul Lewis in Miracles likes to call it the whole show. Your particular access point to the world, your life, what it's like to move around in the world, that is going to shape how you see what's going on in the whole show. That's kind of the basic premise there, if we put it that way. Classically, and this is part of, the title is Bulwarks of Unbelief, and I'm drawing on a sociologist, Canadian philosopher. Maybe some of your listeners will have heard of Charles Taylor. Some of them might not have. Charles Taylor is this very important theorist of secularism and wrote a book called The Secular Age in 2007. And in the beginning of that book, a huge chapter is called Bulwarks of Belief. And what he's trying to do is set up the world in which belief was just natural. In the Middle Ages, say 1500 AD, it was almost impossible for whatever reason. Let's interpret what that is, but it seems like it was almost impossible to doubt the existence of God. And then you go to 2000 AD, right? And even if you're a fervent believer like Shane or I, you can have the experience, nevertheless, of kind of laying awake at night sometimes and be like, well, maybe did I get a dial wrong? Have I done something wrong in the mental algorithm? And that lingering kind of what if is sort of there as at least a kind of mental pest, as it were. And Taylor's saying, kind of your question, something happened in between those two things. And the bulwarks of belief, if I could talk about those, and then bulwarks of unbelief, I think the basic idea there is that the medieval world and most of the world up until the middle of the 19th century, the average human existence was a subsistence existence. It was a subsistence existence where you lived in small communities around people that you couldn't really avoid and in spaces and against forces of nature that you had to navigate around and really couldn't harness or control, except in some very basic ways. And so the experience of what it was like to move around, one way of putting that is the experience of what it was like to move around in the world was very agentic. The agency, the voice itself, I've been living in metropolises all my life, and you're right. I'm sitting here in South Carolina now. It's weird to walk outside and like the forest isn't cut down. Its agency, its voice is very living. It is being itself, and I have to move around it. And society worked that way as well. A town of 200 or 500 or 1,000 people, everybody. They're stubborn. They don't change their ways, and they feel like things you can't just avoid. And in fact, you're dependent on things you can't avoid. And then you add to that, subsistence labor itself is also one where your own agency, your own activity is something you feel very keenly, because even if you hate your quote, quote job, as it were, like, I don't want to be a farmer, you know why you're farming, because if you don't, you're going to die in a very immediate way. It's not by degrees of implication. It's just like ground, plant, food, or die. It's that immediate. And so in the mirror of all of that kind of personal, agentic, interpersonal feeling of an interaction, you might say, the idea of a kind of big capital A agent that just grounds out bottom zero, all of that is just a very natural thing. The cosmos is just like that. And so God is the kind of bottoming out of personhood, agency is that. If you kind of skip over what we talk about then in the modern period, is think of the reversal of all three of those things in some way. You don't actually have to, increasingly with the proliferation of our way of life, have to confront people. You can avoid that very personal dimension of people. If we looked at modern labor systems, we would discover forms of labor where people write books and have whole therapy sessions about the fact that they don't feel connected to what they're doing and they feel carried along even in their very own activity. And then with the vast proliferation of technology, the agency of the creation itself is kind of suffocated, you might say, in some dimension, or at least it's numbed out, you could say. And in the centrifugal force of all that lack of agency, What does the universe bottom out in? Perhaps like as a kind of mental or existential instinct. Maybe it bottoms out in agencylessness all the way down. And that can then create the crisis where what the world might seem like on this kind of visceral register can be in tension with what my mind otherwise knows to be the case. Because my mind can still trace out the arguments for the existence of God and say, those make sense. But why didn't do I feel this weird kind of whole person tension? Sorry, that was a long answer, but I hope it kind of got there.
Well, no, it's perfect because it gets to the exact distinction that the book begins with, which is that, the new atheists have this conceit that for a couple of decades now they've been really perpetuating. And that is that the reason unbelief rose, the reason atheism became a phenomenon is that God got disproved, right? He got put out of a job by science. And so proofs led people away from theism. And I imagine if an atheist happens to be, just for kicks listening to Upstream, the initial response to the conversation here would have been, well, there's a simple reason why we stopped, believing by default, because science disproved God. This is a very different story you're telling than the science disproved God story. You're telling a much subtler, more behind the scenes, sort of like almost subliminal story about how technology and the way we relate to the world change the plausibility structures of the way we think about the divine. Interact with that sort of tension there. Reply to the new atheist for me. Are they right? Are they wrong? What's the deal?
I'll have a couple replies to that. One is just to say, yeah, that whole narrative, not only is it philosophically false, and it's natural to us. I mean, one thing to say is you can be sympathetic to why people think that. It's kind of encoded into our basic storytelling. In fact, the reason Charles Taylor argues I have to talk about secularism not just in a descriptive way, but in a kind of narrative way, I have to tell a story, is because the very cognitive condition we're in is one in which we imagine ourselves to have overcome a previous condition. And so you kind of have to talk about the previous condition because we're modern. Well, that means as opposed to not this. And so there's something in there's a narrative dimension to our very own sense of what it is to be us, and that's very much in the new atheism, and I think it's very insightful.
It's the narrative that people are invoking when they say something like it's 2023.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And one thing is historically, get Derek Peterson's book. I think Shane is aware of this book, Flat Earths and Fake Footnotes, is just an absolutely. This is a narrative that is already dead for the most part among secular historians. Secular historians who aren't really confessionally motivated, they don't think that there's this big historical tension between Christianity and science, the way that this has been portrayed. Among kind of atheist apologists and maybe even some philosophers, I don't think that is caught up. But Derek Peterson has taken two or three generations of great scholarship and consolidated it, sort of in the way Michael Heiser consolidates all the expensive biblical studies. That's what Derek Peterson has done for this topic, really. But yeah, what you just pointed out, Shane, is this was when I struggled with the question of atheism for a lot of reasons at an earlier stage in life. I don't mean I don't have any nights still, but like it was a more potent exchange or potent struggle. And that really was part of the struggle for me, was that feeling that like as you put at the beginning, you're kind of holding on to this, and if I stopped trying really hard, it would just evaporate. And it's like that. Surely it's not supposed to be that way. That seems odd. Like, why would belief work that way? And what Taylor argues is that this is what he calls the subtraction story. The subtraction story for Taylor means once people used to believe in fairies and rivers and stuff, and now we just don't believe in fairies but still believe in rivers and stuff. And so it's like what's happened in history is these accretions have been removed, and what's left over is this thing called atheism, or agnosticism at least maybe is the default option. Taylor is very much arguing, no, intellectually, even as a matter of the history of ideas, atheism is suspended atop its own positive orthodoxies, but orthodoxies that are so subterranean that they're just background noise to you. You don't even know that you have a kind of orthodoxy. And in a sense, Taylor helped me think of the question that way, kind of a subterranean orthodoxy, the way Tom Holland will talk about Christianity still in our civilization, right? That level of subterranean. He helped me think that way. And then what this book is kind of like, can I fill out the picture of kind of the positive circumstance within which this became our imaginative default? And ironically, you're so right. What's really interesting is the narrative is almost the opposite. It wasn't that atheists and Christians argued it out and the atheists won and Christian, that sort of thing. It was actually, most historians of atheism point out that atheism got more popular the more popular apologetics got. And it was because of the very anxiety that anybody needed to defend it. Isn't it supposed to be obvious? The fact that we're writing all these books about the resurrection and the existence of God and all that sort of thing, doesn't that actually kind of like give us an anxiety now that we didn't have before? I just thought everybody.
It's like methinks Paley doth protest too much.
Yes. I mean, it was that was very much part of that was a very significant causal force for some of this rise of atheism, was the anxiety caused by the need to have an apologetics.
At the beginning of your book, you draw this contrast I thought was really sharp, especially for Reformed readers. So people who have run in the kind of Calvinistic Protestant world for a while will know the name Herman Bavinck. His 4-volume Dogmatics is just a kind of a treasured work right now. And I say treasure because it's very expensive on Amazon. But you contrast something that Bavinck says in his Dogmatics with something that John Updike wrote about this gut-wrenching account of losing faith. And then you note the difference between these two. Describe that for us, and then what's going on in those two very different views, because it doesn't sound like you're saying Bavinck is just an out-of-touch guy. He's not aware of his own age.
That's a great question. And actually, so Bavinck is born in 1854, dies in 1921. And in one sense, I'm using Bavinck as he's a figure that lives while the crucial transition I'm talking about actually goes on. And in some sense, he does feel it. Like, I think the recent biography by James Eglinton on Bavinck really shows that in some sense, he's in fact the chief theologian who feels it in that Reform period. In some sense, it makes him a modern theologian. He does, in fact, I didn't know this when I first wrote those sentences, deal more with atheism than I was aware. Nevertheless, in the Dogmatics, which is what I'm quoting from, he does treat it, at least at a rhetorical level, which is to say he can expect his readers to just read these sentences and be like, oh yeah, obviously. And he basically says, there's never really been an atheistic people. Hardcore materialism is really hard for anybody. I'm not sure he wrote those sentences for the second edition. It could be that he was writing those in the first edition and didn't correct them in the second. But nevertheless, the setup is exactly what you did. It's like, on paper, he's treating atheism in a way that he can expect his reader to be like, that's just completely implausible.
It's like a non-starter.
Whereas John Updike, right, of course, John Updike's writing in the 80s, but he's writing about a Calvinist minister in 1910, which is exactly this period. And he describes the minister losing his faith. And it's the best literary description of the loss of faith of which I'm aware. I read it when I was in the deep depths of my own struggle and had to put the book away for a while because it was too intense for me to read. Interestingly, I probably shouldn't have, because he goes on to, interestingly, that minister in the book goes on to lament it. He's kind of sad that the local presbytery kind of tells him, well, just keep preaching for a while and, maybe, it'll probably come back. And he's like, well, it doesn't come back, but he spends the rest of his life lamenting the loss of God. It's not felt to be an emancipatory thing for him, which I didn't know until I read the full thing.
So if we were to just zap ourselves back to the Middle Ages and talk to an average parishioner in a village somewhere, and let's say, what became Germany, and we ask this person, do you ever doubt the existence of God? Do you ever doubt that he actually is real? Not just that Jesus is God, but that God himself is real. You ever think maybe the world just created itself? It's very difficult for me to imagine, and this is, I guess, the modern context in which I live. It's very difficult for me to imagine that person saying, what are you talking about? Of course, I've never imagined that. That doesn't even make any sense to me. It's a silly option. It's like
I think what's behind that, I'll answer that and then say what I think is behind that helps us really capture it, is I think that's exactly right. You could go back and you could find people, I'm sure, who doubted all sorts of, points of orthodoxy, the Christian creed and that sort of thing. So, there's heretics, as it were. But the idea that you doubt that there's just kind of it bottoms out in intelligence and personhood and mind, if you just want to, use a modern term, I think that would have been so wildly implausible to them. And some of it would have been all those forces I'm talking about. But I think something I've begun to appreciate even since writing this book, and I'm trying to write this into some stuff I'm writing now, is I think we've lost a little bit of the immediacy of natural revelation because of the loss of that. And so it's not just that for us, it can be very easy to feel that what natural revelation means is that creation is a kind of, well, take something like intelligent design discourse, which I don't discount, I think is a good discourse. But think about how what it's doing is saying, let me find those things that are marks of intelligence versus, aren't necessarily marks of irreducible complexity. I think the medieval mind would look at that and say, like, that's just kind of extra all the way down just because it bees and it doesn't be in itself. Creation is literally an exhale of the being of God. And so, like, you don't need anything fancy for God to be obvious. That's just a thing that doesn't have its being in itself. And you can tell that it doesn't have, your mind immediately knows that, like, all the items that populate my experience don't have them, their being in themselves. And I don't have my being in myself. And I think in that context, all the things that populate your experience, including yourself, just feel, in a sense, like the exhale of God. And all the arguments then are just making your mind formalize something and say something like, I think if they had discovered contemporary intelligent design discourse, that would be like almost an argument for like divine techne or something like that, something almost on top of what is just already obviously God. In the moment you lose that first step, I think that's the thing is for us, the reason that's weird to us is because that first immediate sense of natural revelation is less visceral. And so we depend more on the formal arguments and we depend more on perhaps the intelligent design style arguments, all of which are good and useful and helpful. And that's one thing I want to just kind of bracket and say very quickly, because I know some of your audience and they don't know me. And one thing I'd say is I think apologetics, for all the things I've said about it, are very good. And they're necessary, especially for us. They've always been necessary, but especially for us, they're very helpful because we're disoriented.
Yeah, that sort of undistinguished medieval sense that the whole thing it must bottom out in something like what we call God. It seems like that's what Anselm in his famously difficult to understand ontological argument is sort of getting at. It's like, okay, well, being is a thing that exists in this world. You and I are beings, but we're beings that came into existence at a certain point. And if you go back before that, we didn't exist. So we're contingent, we're dependent. We bottom out somewhere very much in the story of the world. So if being is real, it has to bottom out somewhere before that, sort of infinite regress of, or apparently infinite regress of beings, little b beings began. And so there has to be a great being, a big being, the best one that you could possibly imagine, greater than which none can be imagined. I don't understand the ontological argument, but that's how I kind of process it in my mind.
Some of the loss of that visceral vision, I think, also gives us something of a loss of what's going on in some of those arguments. Because it's really important to say, like, I think a lot of times, and I know you know this, Shane, but a lot of times, for instance, when we think of these arguments, we think of it as sort of like a thing, we're thinking of a temporal sequence, right? Like one thing came from this, came from this, came from this. But you can also think of a kind of sequence of almost metaphysical priority, which isn't temporal. In other words, the example I could use is I could stack three cans on top of each other. This is just a rough image. In one sense, if I make a domino chain and I kick over a domino and the next domino kicks over a domino, each of the motions in a sense is independent of each other. They're just causing each other sequentially. But if I stack three cans on top of each other and then lift them with my bottom hand, cans 1 and 2 on top of can 1 have their motion through the motion of can 1, which has its motion in my hand. And it's simultaneous, actually, but it's an ordered simultaneity. What you see in the older arguments is this very deep sense that even like us sitting here speaking right now, is not a power we possess because we're creatures, but how do we have that power? And they actually think of a kind of simultaneous rootedness that goes vertical and up, even in a particular moment. So it's not just this must have all come from somewhere, but it's also,
It's coming from somewhere presently.
yes, it is presently being not nothing because being is donating life to it actively right now. You feel that in your bones. And think of an ancient person, it's like we've almost like been disenchanted by sleep, right? That you really do feel like you die. Your consciousness ceases, and then you're raised in the morning, and that's what a day feels like, and that's very visceral. And it's like there's a sense in which that's a reminder of your suspension above nothing. And I think that they felt that very viscerally, like I'm just being given not be nothing all the time.
You mean the time machine we all take to breakfast?
Yes, exactly.
So why do they need all these proofs for God then? If their default's not atheism, what were they trying to prove to themselves?
Yeah, and in a sense, like that's a great question that I only in the last year or two. It's funny because that's so debated. So many people look back on Aquinas and they're like, well, it assumes faith, and he didn't really, So it's like we're all kind of our anxieties in the past. It really was just the return of the whole person to God. In other words, there's that old Christian doctrine that man is the microcosm of the universe. And so it's like, you think of like, this is always fun to think about, right? But right, you think of like there's the physics, kind of the world of physics that becomes the world of chemistry. And on top of that is the world of biology. And then there's angels, and man is this fascinating creature that straddles in himself the fullness of all these kind of layers of the vertical universe, as it were, and gives that a history. But what the older doctors, I think, thought in terms of was the return of the universe to God. In other words, man and all of his faculties, what does it mean to beautify it and give it back to God? Well, it means to retrace. It means to retrace the cosmos, to kind of glorify the cosmos and give it back to God in worship. And so the will given back to God in worship is the perfection of ourselves in doing and loving. And you could talk about this in culture and all these things. But the mind's return to God is the approximation of full knowing. And so it's like, I know God exists on all these registers, but that doesn't mean I don't gain anything from the journey of formalizing in the mind, which is a unique way to return to God, formalizing in the mind how that's known formally. And there's discoveries that are made in that process. And I think this is really Thomas's Summa, right? He's really not trying to deal with atheists for the most part. He's trying to take saints on a journey up into God, and then you discover things about God that you bring back down to the world. And I think that's mostly what the arguments are doing. And they're still doing that for us, actually. Like that function is still very much apropos in learning these things. I think they just take on an extra kind of pastoral and maybe intellectually therapeutic function for us. Therapeutic is in the broad sense for us in our context, and take on a particular ministry to us.
I'm talking today with Dr. Joseph Minich about why we Christians treat our faith as something that we have to hold on to, and why unbelief in some ways feels so natural. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Do worldview conversations intimidate you? Do you feel like you have to have all the answers to navigate secular culture effectively? In his new book, Street Smarts, Using Questions to Answer Christianity's Toughest Challenges, apologist Greg Koukl shows you how to navigate the most common and challenging topics brought up in cultural conversations today. Things like the compatibility of God and science, the trustworthiness of Scripture, gender and sexuality, and more. Through sound reasoning and practical examples, you'll learn how to graciously turn the tables, help unbelievers examine the gaps in their worldview, and point them to Christ as the best explanation of all reality. As a thank you for your gift to the Colson Center this month, we'll send you a copy of Street Smarts so you can learn to navigate these important conversations with confident and informed faith. Request your copy today at colsoncenter.org/upstreetsmarts. We're back on Upstream, talking with Dr. Joseph Minich about his book, Bulwarks of Unbelief. Joe, this concept of felt divine absence plays a big role in your book. And I think we can look back in history and find that this isn't a specifically modern phenomenon, or at least not a uniquely modern phenomenon, that people throughout time have felt the absence of God or the silence of God, is I like the way Andrew Peterson puts it. How does that show up in the ancient world? Perhaps the world of the Bible and then the medieval world. And then what happens on the other side of this shift that you're talking about, where atheism or unbelief begins to be felt as a kind of default? How did people used to experience the absence of God?
That's always such a fun thing to think through. And one way to get at it is to kind of remember your three legs of the problem of evil trilemma, right? Either God isn't all powerful, or he's not all good, or he doesn't exist. And what's interesting is the historic options were always one of the first two. Everybody's always struggled, is God powerful enough to save? And God says, yes, I'm powerful enough to save. And they've struggled, is God good? Yes, I'm good. But most people didn't resolve that in the direction of, well, he just doesn't exist. It's modern that we resolve it in the question, well, obviously it's just because he doesn't exist. That's the
It's actually kind of stunning when you read the Psalms of lament in particular, where David's like, "What? Why aren't you here to rescue me, God? You're so far from saving me. All my enemies are, treading me down. The bulls of Bashan are after me." But at no point in the Psalms that I can think of does David go, "Maybe you're not really there. Maybe I'm just praying to an empty heavens." He never says that.
And even those famous verses, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. I'm not totally certain that there's no kind of cryptic atheism named there, but it's also possible that it's talking about a kind of practical atheism. The fool in his heart is effectively saying there is no, there just is no reality that I have to deal with, that sort of thing. But to answer the question then, yeah, they resolved it in the direction of saying, where are you, Lord? And it's the same way we still experience this part of it. Christians who believe in the God existence, we suffer, and then we're just like, where is God? And God is in both creation and in the fall and in the process of redemption before the eschaton, seemingly created a relationship with us where he's not fully present. He's present in some modes and not in others. And there's pedagogy there. There's all sorts of reasons we could get into for why he does that. But it's experienced in some cases as a crisis and a test for us. In some sense, it's the test of life itself. What goes on in the modern period is that you lose a sense of a kind of divine presence that was obvious to everybody. And then the already experience of a kind of existential, moral, my life experience, divine absence, you might say, that imagination leaks into that more basic space. And now God feels absent, even kind of ontologically and metaphysically. And so the argument for the existence of God, I think this contextualizes why the argument for religious experience takes on such a prominent role in our context.
Meaning like miracles and an immediate sense of God's
Yeah,
presence, answered
exactly,
prayers. Yeah.
exactly, because it's like it's like nature and the world itself aren't reinforcing that. And you could even think in some contemporary apologetics contexts where, say, the belief in God depends upon certain kind of modern arguments. And again, I'm only referring to intelligent design now because there's lots that's good in it. But it's like if all of the arguments depend upon that, then there's a lot of chips, kind of existential and metaphysical chips, are in that basket. And that's a pretty recent conundrum, is basically what I would say. And the way that we experience it is, this is fascinating to me. In Enduring Divine Absence, I tell this story of during my biggest kind of moment of crisis with atheism. I was driving to work one day, and I was listening to the radio, and it was NPR, so you guys will have to forgive me. I was listening to NPR, and there was a young 13-year-old.
This is why you struggle with atheism.
Yeah, exactly, brother. They were giving a kind of story about this like little agnostic camp that a 13-year-old young woman was attending. And it was kind of funny. It was clearly like a parody of Bible camp. It's like, oh, agnostic camp. That's quaint. They hand the mic to this 13-year-old young woman, and they ask her to kind of, present one of her rhetorical barbs for atheism. And she says something to the effect of, if God wanted everybody to believe in him, why doesn't he just like peel back the clouds at 3:00 every day and say, hey, everybody, here I am, and then go away? God time, 3:00 every day, no atheists. And I'm like in the middle of seminary at this point, and I'm like, well, obviously, but really, it hit me. It hit me hard. It turns out that's a really good way to get at how we're framing the issue wrong. W. Norris Clark, I found this in W. Norris Clark, The Philosophical Approach to God. Really, really helpful little book. Norris Clark asked the question, because he comes up with an example like that. How do you know that would be God? If you read enough sci-fi as I do, and really, and this is in a materialist universe. In a materialist universe, you have to ask that because hard consciousness is possible in a materialist universe, and that makes, everybody's trying to upload our bodies into whatever, into some transhumanist nano robot particles that float through the whatever, I don't know. But the point is like sci-fi has imagined gods that look exactly like that. So then you start to play it out. Well, what would it take for God, who's not creation, to actually show you himself? What does he do? Well, it turns out there isn't anything else but to create. There is no other move. There isn't another extra move inside of creation that's more impressive than creation, and there can't be because of what God is. And to say that he has to do this kind of extra thing to kind of make it more obvious in a sense is to ask him actually to become more like a creature when the very fact of his creatorness, what's revealed there, it takes the whole canvas of creation and ultimately his own icon. He's given us an icon, which is Jesus, that holds it all together in a sense, that says who he is. And in a sense, like what's happened is I think we've lost that imagination where when we encounter the world itself, it's like this is the only way that God, when I know what I mean when I say that word, this is the only way that he can reveal to me, and the only way that he can take, and then of course in Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, Lewis plays with a couple of these possible answers. So on the one hand, in the Screw Tape Letters and then in Mere Christianity, he gives the sort of free will defense about that and talks about how the enemy, God, to Screw Tape and Wormwood, hesitates to overwhelm humans with an immediate sense of his presence because then it would sort of obviate the role of faith altogether. It would make belief, at least in that case, coerced. It would be like creating automaton. And for Lewis, that's a no-no. You can't do that. It's sort of mutually exclusive with love. And then on the other side of the spectrum, he also warns a couple of times through characters in Narnia that, well, look, we're actually not objective evaluators of the evidence that enters our senses. In fact, we're quite adept at denying the evidence of our senses. And that sounds like what Jacob Marley says to Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, but that's another good example, right? But in Narnia, there's Uncle Andrew and the dwarves. And so the first book and the last book, you've got these characters who are denying Aslan's existence as a thinking person, as opposed to just a roaring lion or a machine making noise, right? And they can see him and they can hear him, and he's right there. But Aslan says, in essence, I can't do anything for them because they've made themselves unable to hear me. Now, we might would quibble as Calvinists with exactly, God's role in regenerating the heart and giving man the ability to actually hear that word and so forth. But Lewis is making an important point there. It's that we're actually really bad at listening. And in fact, we can decide we don't want to listen and shut out all the ordinary communications of his being and existence.
Yep, and we can even, most hauntingly, in a sense, know that we can do that and still do it because it's so deep in our habits that we don't even know how we do it. We can think we're not doing it and do it. It's just in that our habits with the world. Like none of us these days are very good listeners, just in general, much less listening to creation, and so I think that's a really important point. And you do make I think an important point that on the one hand, you can kind of run the thought experiment in terms of what do we need to kind of prove the being of God? And I think that's where you can say you don't really get something that proves that more than creation itself, and you can't have something that proves that more than creation itself. But there are these other modes of divine presence. God is close to you by virtue of being a creator, in a sense, so close to you that you can't quite imagine it. In fact, one way to get at that is the problem with the Shack's vision of God is not that it puts God too close to you, it's that it puts God too far away. It gives God the distance of a creature rather than the intimacy of a creator. And I think sometimes we think like, oh, it's making God too intimate. Let's shove him back in the clouds. And it's like, no, it's actually making an idol where God is actually more interior. Nevertheless, we're not fully interior to God. God is fully present to us, but we are not fully present to God. And what these moments, I think that Lewis does is there's these kind of moments where you can become more fully present to God, to his speech in the created order, where your soul can kind of curve up out of the incurve stage and you can reflect him more and know him more. All of these things become more obvious, all of that. And there is a negotiation with God and the soul in those moments. And I guess there's one even in Till We Have Faces. It doesn't Orwell also, she has kind of this moment of faintly seeing something.
The castle. Yeah.
Yes, and she kind of has to recognize later that did happen. Like she never really forgets that that happened, and that she had a moment where she could have gone one way or another, and she was stubborn.
There was a juncture there. She suppressed it. Yeah. And this the same theme emerges, of course, in The Great Divorce, where he's very careful not to portray God as giving sort of different revelations of himself to different people that control their destinies. What really controls people's destinies is how willing they are to see those revelations. So, you get the people in purgatory / hell. It's kind of one thing in that parable. They're constantly in the presence of all the goodness that they deny. They actually live inside a crack in the sidewalk of heaven.
Yes.
They're such small beings, and they're determined to ignore everything that's going on there and the goodness it's offered them. And just the whole picture is like everyone, God, the saints, the angels, are just offering real life and goodness to those people in the crack. And the people in the crack are like, no, you have to come down here and we have to have a petty squabble about something. And it's just, that's the way Lewis views it, is that God is so obvious that we actually have to, in our incurved being, our sinful state, we actually have to work very hard to deny him, not to hold on to belief.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so I want to transition the conversation here. We got about 20 minutes, and I want to transition us over to talking about what those bulwarks of unbelief are specifically, and then how we can react to them as Christians, because this is a podcast primarily for Christians. So what's going on? What are the supports that make unbelief feel natural in today's world?
Yeah, to return to that kind of taxonomy, if I were to think in terms of sort of three moving parts, I just want to think of how do you relate to people, how do you relate to the world, how do you relate to yourself, something like that. I think those bulwarks are, let's just let's start with just the world of technology itself, and say that most Americans say, and this is true increasingly of most Western societies or developing countries. I shouldn't even say Western, just kind of economically developing countries. The vast majority of the world right now, for the first time since the 19th century, lives in cities and lives largely now in metropolises. So we're all kind of in big metropolises, which means an enormous amount of us live in a world where we live in a world of lights, a world of street lights. We live in a world of roads and automobiles. We live in a world where we get food from a store. And I could add, all I'm really doing is naming a million things. But if you add together all that does for us, what I argue is that it has created a world that is convenient for man and around which I don't have to navigate. It's been sort of tailored for me to accomplish an economic end. Cities are mostly designed for a lot of, I won't make it too complicated. But the idea there is that there's something about the voice of creation itself that formerly insisted upon me and that I have to navigate around, that's kind of suspended because I've leveled it. And that's not always bad. I'm not against roads or cars or anything. We're not trying to be nostalgic here. But there's a kind of ubiquitousness to the degree to which it's leveled, such that you can live a normal life these days and really, really not ever experience the world of animality that much, or really experience the wilds. And here's an interesting one that I just recently learning to appreciate: the sky. How much of human history is really related to staring up? And like modern people, like I don't have experiences. I just now live in South Carolina, as Shane said, and this is the first time in my life I feel like I'm just now meeting the sky. Like I've never met the sky before. I feel like the Green Lady in Paralandra. I've lived under this canopy my whole life, and the canopy's been removed, and it's deeply spiritually significant. And here's an interesting way to get at that. How does nature teach us? Again, because of we're modern people, maybe one of the ways we imagine nature teaches us is that we go look at the trees and we say like, well, the trees do this and I can do that. And we kind of mentally conclude something. But I wonder if part of the way you're much more of an outdoors person than me. And I suspect one of the ways, I just wonder if you'll resonate with this. I find the way nature teaches me is actually that the trees just are at peace. And to be with them is to actually be given, in some sense, their peace.
Yes.
And so when Solomon walks around and points at things, he is using his mind to kind of extract a pattern, but it's a pattern that he's entered and has actually been kind of taught in his body by virtue of interaction with that world. And so
What happens with me, if I could just say real quick,
Oh
what
yeah, go
happens with
ahead.
me is that's a really fascinating way to put it, because my experience is I look at the trees, I look at the, fish underwater, the coral, I look at the birds and butterflies, and every one of those beings is being itself perfectly. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do, and it's following a purpose. And I see in every one of those, I see purpose, design, intention, telos, and it's following that. And I look at myself then as a creature that's made of the same stuff, more or less, as those creatures, and I say, well, what's up with me then? Because I experienced this disjunction where
Yeah.
I must have a purpose, but I'm quite sure that I'm not following it at all times. So what's happening there? And it forces you to face immediately the sense that you are alienated from your intended purpose. And that brings you face to face with God immediately. You can't deny that like you can indoors in air conditioning, surrounded by
Yes.
technology.
Yeah. The teaching is so immediate, and yeah, on the purpose angle, part of that, of course, is that man is that weird creature whose participation in his own end is an object for himself. By which I mean, fish participate in their own end, but they just kind of do it. Whereas God says, "Hey, participate in your own end." And the way that we do that is through consciously saying "okay" and doing it. And our problem is we're like, well, we kind of negotiate not doing it a little bit. Uh, but yeah, you have that whole angle, but then you have the angle, and I think this is the labor angle of it. I think this is among evangelical circles. I think at least since the 80s, and not entirely. I think there's a lot of evangelical exceptions to this, but I think there hasn't been enough talk about modern labor systems and what a godly, helpful labor pattern is that gives a person dignity and a sense of meaning. In other words, if we've organized a civilization in such a way that the average person is mostly doing something they don't really care about, mostly for the ends that another person has established, and they just kind of got to plug into the market that's established by, that sort of thing, well, then people's sense of immediate purpose and with what they're doing with their hands and their mind and their life, that's going to be really obscured in some way. And this is why we write novels about it. Kurt Vonnegut's Player Piano is this fascinating philosophical reflection on what happens when UBI takes, the machines do all the work, and maybe there's a couple of UBI has taken over, everybody makes a little money, nobody's starving, but there's nothing to do because the machines do it all.
That's why there's that Counting Crows song about paving paradise to put up a parking lot.
Yes. Yes, yes. I thought it was Joni Mitchell, but whatever. Who cares?
Maybe so. Take that out if I got it wrong.
Yes, this podcast doesn't even know that we're in the parking lot. We're not boomers here, so we have excuses. In modern labor, I think there's a lack of connection between my very aptitudes and what I do a lot of the time, and the ultimate goal that I have in doing it. One of the reasons for that is the relationship of all of it to money. In a subsistence culture, this is weird for us to think because we're so dependent on this thing called money. But in a subsistence culture where there's maybe a thick commons, there's like a forest, you can shop, you might have a hard life, but you mostly are just working. You take your food, you give a share of it to somebody, but it doesn't take this thing called cash to get a house or land or food. You just live on land. There's ways that you've kind of ordered society to be able to do that. In modern society, as those spaces become less available and you see populations move towards cities, city life depends upon wages because now housing, food, all of it costs currency, which puts everybody in a position of having to do this peculiar thing called get a job. Everybody's always worked, everybody's always labored. But actually, as Ivan Illich points out, even today, there are many modern languages that do not have a phrase for going to work, for work as a thing you go to 5 days a week. That's a very new way of imagining what it is to be. And it's not clear that we have fully absorbed the full existential, mental, spiritual, and cultural impact of that, and maybe what it does to our sense of reality in general. And then you add that third layer, which is just what does that do to our communities, especially when you have two workers in a home. Suburbs maintained a sense of community only because half of the population was at home. And the moment everybody leaves and comes back, you actually have independent castles. People don't know their neighbors. And then you add the internet. People talk on Facebook. You don't have to talk to anybody on Facebook. You don't have to know your neighbors. And what's happening is the kind of personal is sucked out of all these immediate access points, which doesn't mean it goes away. It just means in this kind of fun house of foggy mirrors, you might say, what's mutually reflected between all those mirrors is agentlessness all the way down. And so it can feel like, how does my apologetics book kind of on the scale of that feels big? And how does my apologetics book get on the other side of the scale weigh against that? I think some people feel like that's a bigger weight.
In some ways, the apologetics book cooks in those assumptions that cause the doubt to be so persuasive. And so you can put the apologetics book on top, but just like we were talking about with the Middle Ages, the very fact that you feel those are questions that need to be answered so urgently kind of tells on you. It says you're the kind of person who needs sort of specific arguments to these in answer to these problems. And again, I think that many of the arguments are excellent, but we have to be very aware of what's going on below the surface. So I think this is an important turning point here, not just in this conversation, but in what I've been talking with guests about on Upstream recently. So I had Samuel James on recently to talk about his book, Digital Liturgies. And much of that is this kind of deep behind the scenes work of what the internet and social media has done to our thinking, how it's changed our brains, how it's changed our relationships, how everything is shaped around that in ways we don't even think about or notice. And so my question to him at the end of the conversation was, well, are you saying that we should just kind of be Luddites and abandon all this? And this is a tension that I live in personally because I don't know what the answer to all that is. I think of Lewis's famous line in It's in Surprise by Joy, where he talks about the automobile. And he talks about what the automobile has done to us and how it's annihilated space and how it's transformed us into these people who don't move through the world beholding it. We just move through the world to get to point B, from point A to point B. It's like, what do you do when you recognize how material processes have and economic processes have changed your thinking? What do you then do with that? Do you run out to the woods? And I don't want to slander Wendell Berry, but I know he represents that impulse to move in that direction. Do you go to the woods of South Carolina and become a farmer so you can be more in touch with the land? What's the response to these revelations?
Yeah, and this is the burden of the fourth chapter in the book is like, I think you can tell in the book, I'm really not nostalgic for any of the past. I really think we should be grateful and happy to live when we do. And with all of these pressures, like we should be excited and agentic and recover a sense of agency and have some sense of like, where are we? You know, what might God be doing in the modern world? Why would he have us go through this trial? Both Lewis and Bavinck will treat modernity as a kind of trial that's historical, that God's in control of, and that the church has some lessons to learn out of. And we don't need to be weird about that or super progressivist and say, well, it's going to be when, you know, women clergy are happening. That's when we get a, or something like that. It's not that. Bavinck will just say it's just love. Like, you know, we actually need to learn a deeper subterranean relationship to God in some way. And I think there's a lot of good effects of the modern world in all those ways. And I think another thing to say there, one of the ways to help us see that is that it turns out the grass is greener works chronologically as well. To use your time machine example, the Middle Ages, even if everybody thought God was obvious and that, you know, there weren't any like trans hours at the library or whatever it is, nevertheless, these were not worlds full of godly people. The church was not okay. Society was not okay. Families were not okay. The liturgy wasn't okay. If you go to Old Testament Israel, where miracles are happening and God is right there, nothing's okay. If you go to the New Testament church, where you got the apostles and all the things, nothing is okay. It's never been okay. And so, like, there's a nostalgia that says, let's go back and then we're going to have different problems. And it's like, no, we have these problems. And actually, if you guys went back and tried to do the Middle Ages lumberjack thing, like, I don't think we understand how many layers of removal that would be and what it would actually mean. And the other side of it, which is funny to me, is I could totally imagine a Middle Ages person, a person in the Middle Ages, who, if they could get in a time machine and come 500 years to now, might say that, well, I'll trade a trans hour at the library for dying less easily, you know, say, for instance. And so, like, some of it is just to say, like, that conversation can be too larpy and kind of in the clouds, and it's like, realistically, life has always been very hard, and I don't want to be overly reductionist there. The other side I say to that is, I suppose I want to make sure that there's a pressure to have a heart for the massive population of civilization still. And so one thing I don't like is when I detect too much of let's go get in the escape capsule. Well, the rest of civilization burns down because it's unsustainable. And then, maybe we'll go back there after the ashes are cleared or something like that. And I think sometimes there can be too much of this isn't about any individual. This is really about me. It could be about anybody. A lack of loyalty, in a sense, to like the country. Like we want the country to go well. I want it to function well. And so, what do? I'm not a luddite. There's the Tech Wise Family by Andy Crouch, right? There's ways to think about these things. There's a handful of things I could say. One of it is if labor is part of the issue, thinking about other ways of having labor, I think, are very interesting. And in a post Zoom age, there's a lot of ways to think about this. Because people can work from home now, it's not so gendered in the sense that it might be man or woman at home. But because a lot of people can work from home now, there's actually a greater capacity in the modern world for neighbors to know each other because there's more at home bodies. There's more capacity for small town revitalization because of that, because you can buy a cheap house in a town of 20,000 that's, not growing. And nevertheless, you can work with an interconnect connection in a lot of cases. And so a lot of these things I think are just people, everyone, not just Christians, everyone feels the forces we're talking about, that lack of meaning, that lack of community. And people, I think, are naturally finding ways. The great sorting is one way of doing it, right? But are naturally finding ways, I think, to reestablish community. That said, I really think one of the vestiges of old community that is fascinating to me is the local church. Because in some ways, in the modern world, I think one of the apologetics for Christianity that can happen is this is a vestige of an old community. A church, especially a church that is very tied to a kind of a roughly not terribly large area, you do get at least some approximation of what it's like to be with people. And to bring in then an insight of Lewis, I think what we can do is forget that the human face is always available. And the human face is actually the chief path to reenchantment. The most sacramental thing, I remember quite how Lewis puts it, the most sacred object that you ever encounter is your neighbor. It's not nature, it's actually a person. And so in the city, I think like that imagination has to take over. But what that means, particularly for particular people, a lot of that's I think just going to have to do with people's individual competencies, what they can handle. I think there are some people that are not going to do well in a big metropolis. Like I wouldn't judge somebody that says, "I'm not sure humans are meant to handle living in the middle of 7 million people, and I'm just not doing well with that." I don't judge that.
Yeah, that's probably where I fall, to be honest. Because every time I visit like New York, I feel like I got to get off this island as fast as I can because like there's only so much time I can spend in Central Park, right?
Yes. Whereas we have a mutual friend in New York, Susanna, who when she tells me when she leaves New York, she feels like she's going to float into the sky or something. It's like there's no blankets on. It's like this is way too. It's like
That's
highly
the
nerve
point.
wracking.
That's the sky. You get to see the sky
Yeah.
again for the first time. I have to have an argument with her about this. It'd be fun.
Yes, and here, I mean, I'm in my 40s, and this is the first time I've ever lived kind of in nature. And so, I really have a heart for staying. And yet I also understand saying, hey, there's being connected to nature is very helpful.
Yeah, I wonder as we close here, I wonder if the church might be the kind of witness you're describing in a very simple and often overlooked way, and that is just by being a community of humans living in a human way and interacting in human terms via the face, via the voice, via presence, via touch. And there's this essay Matthew Crawford just wrote at First Thing. It's called "The Rise of Anti-Humanism," and the
Hmm.
idea, really good stuff. The idea is that big tech is essentially possessed of this not just transhumanist but anti-humanist mentality, that the ways of being human that we just talked about are actually archaic, bad, outdated, inefficient, stupid, and that humans themselves are actually quite stupid creatures. And so we need to technologically empowered oligarchy, here we're starting to sound very abolition of man, right, should create efficiency, optimize us and our lives through technology. And that just is his case. That's just the worldview that technology is developed on at this point. And so what would it look like if a different outlook were in charge of a Silicon Valley, or the guys who put together cars and said, no, we want this to actually maximize the human experience, not minimize it.
Yeah, a person who thinks I know there are people who are thinking about this in tech, and it's not. I hate to say that like human tech. Obviously, the documentary, The Social Dilemma, involves some people that are trying to think through some of these kinds of questions. I'm not sure they're. It's unclear to me how far I can go with some of their hypotheses. Another guy that's interesting on something like this, though, that might, at least by analogy, give some interesting principles, is Richard Sennett, who writes about city building. He spent 30, 40 years talking about architecture and city planning and that sort of thing. And he just wrote his book, Building and Dwelling, which is the end of a 3-volume work on craftsmanship. And then cooperation. Human cooperation is the second volume as a craft. But then city building as a craft. And what he tries to do is imagine, how do you imagine the designing of space for humans to flow together, for them to encounter each other's bodies, and even spaces where you can be alone in public. So he has a big thing about the one table. So it's like one guy can sit down and be around people, but there's nevertheless this site where the human body hits each other. And he wants to think about, how do you organize, in a sense, use techne to actually enhance, not putting it in terms of efficiency. I think that's where we get all weird. It's actually just to actually make sure we don't avoid to avoid each other, which a lot of design can do.
So a young man or young woman approaches you, says, Joe, I'm feeling the same way that you just described you were feeling at a certain point earlier in life, where you're struggling with atheism. You feel this existential pull toward doubt that the heavens must really be silent because there's no one there. There's no one home. God doesn't exist. And that feels intuitive to this person. What would you tell them? What questions should they ask?
Yeah, I would say that, first of all, I just sympathize. I'd say my suspicion is it has a lot to do with the imagination, only because I happen to have written on it. I suppose I'd try to give them a copy of my book, but that's not. Yeah, really, it should just be. Yeah, I think if I were talking to a young person, I would not give them a copy of my book. I would start asking them about their life. How connected are you to people? How connected are you to your own life? How connected are you to many other things? And I'd almost want to then say, yeah. Does what feels plausible change when you recreate those connections? Because I wonder if it does. I've begun to say, like, I do think, because those moments are very persuasive, but they ultimately are moods. And that's one thing I'd want to say is maybe what you're going through really is, and I don't mean that in a dismissive or reductive way, but it's kind of an existential mood. Our whole culture can be in a mood, in a sense. That can be an existential intellectual mood almost. That's very hard to get out of. And a lot of things are like that. They take gestalt shifts to get out of. It's just a flip. It's everything black and white just switch, and then everything's different. And that's what I think those moments are like. And I think just being able to name that and tell people you don't need to freak out in that. One thing I always say in that situation is, you should never imagine, because this is the extra tension, especially I think we as evangelicals might feel, is we should never imagine that God is up there only available behind us getting all of that journey correctly. And so it's like, look, if you're doubting God's existence, he's going to be just fine. He loves you and he can handle that. Pray. You can still pray. And then often, to be honest, what I did in a lot of these things was just jump off the intellectual cliff and say, God, if you're there, help me. And it's like, if God loves me, he'll save me. And he has. And so, like, I really think you can just do that. If your mind going on a journey toward the truth is always a good thing. And sometimes it's confusing. And sometimes you hit these things where it's like, I don't even know what this is. And at that moment, you really can you don't need to just immediately integrate it. You can press into it and you can say, hey, God, please protect me in this kind of valley over here. And he loves you and he'll protect you.
Amen. Well, my guest today has been Dr. Joseph Minich, author of Bulwarks of Unbelief, Atheism, and Divine Absence in a Secular Age. Joe, thanks so much for joining me on Upstream and for your intriguing and really thoughtful work.
Thanks, brother.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media or by visiting upstream.colsoncenter.org.